Welcome to Scaling with Agility. I'm Yuval. I often talk about Agile theater, and today what I wanted to do is dive deeper into why does the theater happen and how to start conversations that get you away from it. And I'm going to use a tool called outcome mapping that I've learned from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden from Sense and Respond to work through the situation. So let's maybe start with what are the behaviors that you will see with Agile theater. Jeff and Josh use this language of who does what by how much in their conversation about OKRs. And you can also use that language to describe a situation before you intervene. So if I wanted to describe to you what does an Agile theater look like, let's explore a couple of these statements. So what would be a key behavior that would tell us that we're seeing an Agile theater? We would see team members practicing mechanics, where most of the time they don't really see the value. They practice, let's say 80% of the mechanics to be able to say we're doing something rather than to get a meaningful outcome. So that's one example of an Agile theater. Another example, we measure whether we have objectives and key results, not whether the objectives and key results are actually useful, to use OKR language to look at OKR theater. So as you can see, what we're doing here is we're using customer behaviors to assess, to learn on what is going on, and that immediately can help us start to intervene. So what we could start to say is, first of all, let's ask ourselves, why do we even need that process? Why are people following this process? Why are we seeing this behavior? Why are managers telling their teams to follow a certain process? We might come up with an answer of this is what senior leadership asked them to do. But why are senior leaders asking to follow a certain process? Because at some point, at some level, somebody got convinced that it would be useful. What was the convincing about? What was the impact that we were hoping for? Now it might get interesting. Now we can start to ask, okay, what was that impact that we were initially looking for? Let's say for OKRs. Okay, let's focus on OKRs as a theater. So maybe we were starting to see that people are working in different directions, and we wanted to get some alignment going on. So maybe the impact we were looking for was improved alignment. Maybe what we were seeing was that there was too much going on in the organization, and we wanted to improve focus, cross-functional focus. Okay. Fair. Now, what often happens is we might have those goals, but then we jump immediately, as so often happens in product as well, to features, to outputs. We want alignment. Okay, let's have objectives and key results. That would provide alignment and focus. What's missing is the connective tissue here. How do OKRs achieve alignment? If we just call something OKR, would that achieve alignment? It reminds me of the underpin. I don't know if you've seen that, but there's this episode in South Park where the gang notices that all of the underpants in the city are getting stolen, go missing. And eventually, the South Park gang and a set of gnomes that are stealing all of the underpants. There's a huge mountain of underpants that they've been stealing. And the gang asks, why are you doing that? What's the plan here? And the gnome answer, step 1, steal all the underpants. Step 3, domination, right? Step 3 is the impact. Step 1 is the feature, the underpants. And the gang asks, okay, what's step 2? Step 1 collect all the underpants. Step 3, domination. And a lot of the conversations with organizations look, ironically, like the underpants kit. Nobody knows the middle layer. The middle layer is like, what's the strategy? What are the outcomes that we're looking for? How will the underpants help us achieve world domination? So going back to OKRs, let's say OKRs are supposed to help us achieve alignment, and let's add here alignment with autonomy. They're supposed to provide this weird combination where people know where they're going and are going in a direction that is strategic, that is where we need them to go as an organization, but they also have the autonomy to figure out how to do that. This alignment with autonomy, by the way, is how we achieve agility. The ability to seek towards valuable results. So if that is the impact that we want to achieve, and let's say we're focused on, we got the idea to maybe use OKRs in that space, one important thing to do, even if OKRs were suggested to us, is to figure out what are the behaviors that we want to create. So instead of a behavior where people create OKRs just because they were told, what we want to find is the sort of behaviors that would enable people to be aligned and to have an autonomy. So let's unpack that for a second. What would we need in order to have autonomy in an organization? So what would autonomy look like? Autonomy would look like, one outcome would be leaders trust and empower, right? Another one is that teams step up, right? They make decisions themselves. But let's unpack the leaders' trust. What would be required for leaders to trust? One thing is they know what teams are working on. So you could say leaders know what their teams are working on 80% of the time at the right level. You might say leaders need to see that people are actually heading in the right direction. So see evidence of traction, let's say. What will be a leading indicator or leading outcome that would get us to the point that there's evidence of traction? How do we get traction? To cut a long story short, by focusing on few key things and having clarity on what they are and what's the sort of traction that we need, we will start to get that traction. So the OKRs are a mechanism to achieve traction. Traction and the evidence of it would build trust. And by building that trust, we would create empowerment. We would get to the point that leaders, let their teams know what is important and step out of the way for 80% of the work that the organization does. So maybe let's dive into that a bit. If you look at the way decisions are made in an organization, the typical organization would see leaders being involved in a lot of the decisions. If you think about it like a pyramid, there would be decisions that teams are trusted to make. A lot of the decisions leaders would feel they need to be involved with. And an important reason, there are a couple of reasons why that happens. One is inertia. Another one is that they don't necessarily trust that their people know where to go. They feel like they need to have control. They're expected to have control. Their leaders are asking them what is going on, so they're expected to know what is going on. What we would like to see over time by using OKRs effectively is we would like to see an environment where there are more and more decisions that are made in teams, more and more initiative, decentralized control, whatever you want to call it, autonomy, without compromising the quality of these decisions. The outcomes are ideally even better, even though as leaders, we're not involved in as many conversations. So going back to theater, for me, this is an indication of we're making real progress towards the sort of organization that we want to be. And I don't care. What do you use for this? You could say, I'm using OKRs for this, I'm using Safe PI planning, I'm using Scrum, I'm using whatever. I don't really care what are you using as the practice to enable that. What I care about is not the vanity metric of how many people have been certified in a certain process, or how many events are we running of a certain process, or how much stuff do we have in our tool. What I care about is the outcome. What percentage of the time do leaders provide intent and empower their teams? So now what do you do with this realization? There are a couple of things you could do. One is, if you are a leader of an organization and you're feeling there's an agile theater, you're feeling that there's a lot of investments in processes for process sake, the first thing to start to do would be to map out what are the concrete behaviors that you don't like right now. What are the behaviors that feel like theater to you? And then work back from these behaviors to what's driving these behaviors. Also, what's the impact of these behaviors? What is going on here? There might even be this cause and effect loop, the negative flywheel, where the more we focus on something, it eventually drives us. So if you look at it from above, it looks like a loop, but if you look at it from the side, it might look like a downward spiral that's eventually going to get you to a very bad spot. And I'd probably argue that this is what is going on in the agile theater space. So we've started with a reasonable place, but by focusing a little bit on vanity metrics, on certification, on spreading the practices in the organization, we lost focus on outcomes. We started focus on some other things. For example, that created practitioners that were doing it for the wrong reasons. By doing it for the wrong reasons, it started to lose its effectiveness. The practice starts to lose its effectiveness. Because it's starting to lose its effectiveness, it's even harder to get people to do it. They become cynical to it. But because they don't want to do it, and we're still focused on our transformation metrics, we become even more focused on compliance, and we start to measure the wrong things, and people hate it even more, and we lose sight of the important reason to do this even more, and this goes into a spiral where there's even no recognition of the good reason we were doing this in the first place, and it's just become a downward spiral of theater. The way out of that is to remember that connection. Remind ourselves, what is the connection? Find outcomes in the language of who does what, that we believe are related to the impact that we want to have on our organization, not success in the transformation. I don't care about success in the transformation. What I care about is, why did we have this transformation idea in the first place? What's the impact that we want to see? Do we want to see alignment, agility, more innovation, less time spent planning the work, more time doing the work, whatever it is? What are we trying to achieve? What are outcomes that we believe would lead to that? And here it might be a bet, might be an assertion, but it should be an educated assertion. We should have clarity on what is the chain of thinking that we believe will drive this. And then set to ourselves goals that are focused on these outcomes, not on the vanity metrics. So the goals might be less about what sort of events we have. They would be more about how people actually behave. How quickly do we find about risks, let's say? Ideally, what we want to find is outcomes that create a viral loop, that creates a positive reinforcing effect, that create a positive flywheel. So ideally, what we want is to find something where an intervention would actually lead to healthier and healthier interventions. Focusing on outcomes is something like that. So if you focus on outcomes and avoid telling people how to achieve those outcomes, the more you let people be players rather than pawns, the better they will feel about their work, the more innovative work they will do, the better the outcomes of that work will be. Eventually, what will happen is it will build more trust to empower people even more. So choosing to focus on the right behaviors will eventually help us create the flywheel where over time it will be easier and easier to see progress towards where we go. At the beginning, it will be hard to make a change from focusing on outputs and book of work and managing detailed stories and leaders being involved in every, but as they see more and more of these results, it will become better and better. I'll give you another example. So back many years ago, I was working with a technology company that was releasing their product to e-commerce players every quarter. And we were talking about, we want to continuously deploy. We want to release something every 2 weeks. It was almost unfathomable for the team that was looking at this, the QA manager, QA director for this organization, to think about such a frequent release. But what they started doing was they said, okay, we're going to go into this cycle. Every 2 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to release something. But it's not going to be just we're starting to work in a 2-week cycle because that's how you work in Scrum. No, what it was, we're doing 2 weeks because what we want is to deliver more frequently, because what we want is to get feedback and reduce the risk of releases. So what we need to do is not just say that we're working in 2 weeks, like a lot of teams do. What we need is to actually release something valuable at the end of the 2 weeks, even if that is hard. And initially, it was very hard for them to do that. It required setting aside 3 days for the entire group out of each 2 weeks, each 10 days, so 30% overhead to do this ongoing release. Pretty expensive. But once they started to do that, once they started to see that they can actually release and that those releases actually have higher quality because they're testing them, and lower risk, or even when there is risk, there were still escape defects like there were before. They didn't improve their testing, they just ran the testing more often. Even when there was an escaping defect,